Back in the 1980s, my husband and I bought 10 acres of empty land for $5,000 using part of a settlement from a car accident he'd been in. Nearly 30 years later, a nightmare neighbor flooded that land and had 23 of our trees illegally cut down, and it ended up handing me the best revenge of my entire life, one that's still paying off 6 years after I finally sold the property. We bought that land young, with big plans to eventually build a home on it, but life kept getting in the way it tends to. Instead of a house, it slowly turned into something else entirely, a spot for weekend parties, camping trips, and eventually a dirt track where our kids spent half their childhood tearing around on dirt bikes. We loved that land exactly the way it was, even without a single building on it. Some of my favorite memories from raising our kids happened out there. Bonfires that ran too late into the night, tents pitched in whatever configuration the weather allowed that weekend. The sound of dirt bike engines echoing across the open acreage every single summer. It wasn't a house, but it was absolutely a home in every way that actually mattered to our family. Friends used to ask us for years when we were finally going to build something permanent out there, and we'd always laugh and say eventually, never quite in a hurry, because the land was already doing exactly what we needed it to do without a roof or 4 walls. For most of those years, nothing about the property caused us any trouble at all. Then about 15 years before I ever posted about any of this, new neighbors moved into the property next door, and one of them turned into an absolute nightmare almost immediately. She had a problem with our trees blocking part of her view. She had a problem with a small stream running near the property line, convinced it was somehow encroaching onto her side even after a survey said otherwise. She had a problem, apparently, with any noise at all coming from our land, and she wasn't shy about calling or texting us over the smallest things, sometimes multiple times in a single day, sometimes over nothing more than a lawnmower running on a Saturday afternoon. We tried to be reasonable neighbors about it for a long time, genuinely tried, adjusting where we parked, keeping the kids off the bikes earlier in the evenings, even offering at one point to plant something along the property line if it would help with her view. None of it satisfied her for more than a week or two before some new complaints started up. Reasonable clearly wasn't going to be enough for her. Eventually she stopped complaining and started acting. First, she dammed the stream that ran near our property line, and the water backed up and flooded a good portion of our land. I had to round up some help just to get out there and undam it myself, since waiting on anyone else to fix it wasn't getting us anywhere. Then, not long after that, she somehow arranged to have 23 of our trees cut down. Actual, mature trees, gone, despite every single one of them standing well within our own property line, not hers. At that point, I stopped trying to be the reasonable neighbor and started looking into what our actual options were. It turned out I knew someone who knew someone with real experience in exactly this kind of legal violation, and once that connection got involved, things moved, just slowly. There were surveys to confirm the property line, appraisals to figure out what mature trees like that were actually worth, and enough back and forth that some months it felt like nothing was happening at all. It took a few years to work all the way through, but by the end of it, I'd been awarded $10,000 for every single tree that had been cut down, 23 trees in total, plus another $45,000 just from selling off the salvaged timber. On top of that came separate fines and damages tied directly to the flooding she'd caused by damming the stream in the first place. Altogether, it added up to well over $300,000 on a piece of land we'd originally paid $5,000 for. Our $5,000 investment was suddenly looking extremely lucrative, and none of it would have happened if she'd just left our trees and our stream alone in the first place. Years passed. My husband eventually passed away, and with him went any real plan we'd ever had to build a home out there together, a plan we'd been quietly circling back to every few years without ever quite starting it. Holding on to 10 acres of land that now just reminded me of a future that wasn't going to happen anymore didn't make sense, so I decided to sell. I listed it at $1 million, right around market value at the time, but I was specific about one thing from the very start. I didn't want to sell to a developer who'd cram 10 houses onto that land and disappear. I wanted an individual buyer, someone who'd actually live there. The neighbor, predictably, spent the entire time the property was listed trying to scare off potential buyers, dropping unsolicited comments to anyone who came to look at the land, warning them about supposed problems, doing whatever she could to make the sale fall through. Eventually a family came along who offered less than asking, and I mean significantly less, but they had exactly the kind of plan I didn't know I'd been hoping for the whole time. They wanted to build a single-family home on the far end of the property, as far from the difficult neighbor as physically possible, and use most of the remaining acreage to build a proper dirt bike track for their 2 young sons. I remember sitting with that offer for exactly one evening before calling my agent back, running the numbers one more time even though I already knew what I was going to say. I took that offer immediately the next morning, $250,000 under my original asking price, without a single second of real hesitation once I'd let myself admit what actually mattered to me here. Between the compensation I'd already collected over the flooding and the trees, and knowing exactly what kind of neighbor this family was about to become for her, it honestly didn't feel like a loss to me at all. It's been 6 years since that sale went through. I still drive out to see the property every so often, just to check in on how it's coming along, and everything happened exactly the way I'd hoped it would. The family built a lovely home at the point furthest from her property line, and true to their plan, there's now a full dirt bike track running along the section closest to her fence. I never blocked her number either, so I still get the occasional message from her, complaining about the noise, the dust, whatever it happens to be that week, and every single one of those messages honestly puts a smile on my face, knowing she's still out there being miserable about a situation she brought entirely on herself. When I first shared this story looking for outside reactions, the response was about as one-sided as I've ever seen on something like this. The general consensus was that she'd had this coming for a very long time, that between the constant harassment, damming a stream that wasn't hers to touch, and illegally cutting down 24 trees that belonged to someone else, there was really no version of this where sympathy landed anywhere near her side. A lot of people specifically zeroed in on the fact that I didn't just take the money and walk away quietly, that choosing a buyer specifically because they'd bring years of exactly the kind of noise she'd always hated was its own separate, perfectly legal form of justice layered right on top of the financial one. Plenty of other people jumped in with their own nightmare neighbor stories, more than a few of them somehow also involving dirt bikes specifically, which honestly made me laugh reading through them. Quite a few comments also pointed out how rare it is for someone to actually stay patient enough to see something like this through over years instead of settling for a quicker, smaller win early on, and that the payoff here only existed at all because I didn't rush any part of it, from the legal case all the way through to picking exactly the right buyer years later. There was even a bit of a friendly debate in the replies over whether this really counted as petty revenge, since that's technically the community I'd originally posted it to, or whether it had long since crossed over into something closer to nuclear, given just how long the whole thing played out and how much money and misery ended up involved by the time it was finally over. A smaller group of people brought up something a little more thoughtful, that the most satisfying part wasn't really the money at all, it was that I'd found a way to make the consequence match the original harm almost perfectly. Noise and disruption paid back with more noise and disruption, permanently, instead of some unrelated punishment that wouldn't have meant nearly as much to her specifically. Looking back on all of it now, I don't think I'd change a single decision along the way, not the years it took to get the legal side handled properly, and definitely not taking less money for the property in exchange for knowing exactly what kind of neighbors she was about to be stuck with permanently. I think about my husband sometimes when I drive out there, and I like to think he'd have found the whole thing just as funny as I do, maybe funnier, since he was always the more stubborn one between the two of us when it came to people who tried to push us around, the kind of person who'd have driven out there himself just to watch the dirt bikes go by on a Saturday morning. Some of the most satisfying revenge isn't the kind that happens fast. It's the kind you're patient enough to let build for years, until it finally lands all at once and never really stops landing. So I'll leave you with the same question this got left with. Would you have taken the higher offer and walked away? Or would you have done exactly what I did and taken the loss for the payoff that keeps on paying?